Welcome everyone. My name's Colin Graham, and as Pádraig says, we're running a series of events called My Identity over the next few months, interviewing people about their sense of who they are and how they've come to be who they are and what they think about the notion of identity. Really delighted to see you all here today. We had a massive sign up for this event, and then we had what I think is called a weather event, which has probably meant that not as many people were here as we expected or who wanted to be here. I'm really privileged today to be talking to Colin Davidson about his life and his work, and I just want a quick introduction to both the event and then to Colin himself. As Pádraig says, the ARINS project has a particular remit, and one of the things that interested me in looking at that remit was that the ARINS project says that it seeks to research the diverse identities and traditions on the island and how they are understood, felt, expressed and promoted. There's no better person to have that conversation with about how identity is felt, expressed and promoted than the painter Colin Davidson. Colin's work understands and it feels and it expresses the life of the island in the most profound of ways, through his landscapes, through the intimacy of his portraits of politicians and public figures, and through his important work in silent testimony publicising the plight of victims and survivors of the Troubles. And we'll be talking about all of those things today. Colin's work, I'm sure, is known to most of you, but a brief introduction. He was born in Belfast, he studied there, and he lives there now. He's a former president of the Royal Ulster Academy, and he's currently Chancellor of Ulster University. Among his most prominent commissions have been a portrait of Angela Merkel for the cover of Time magazine when Chancellor Merkel was Time Person of the Year, and official portraits of Bill Clinton, Queen Elizabeth II, and President Michael T. Higgins. All of this has a certain kind of glamour about it in a way, but the most important things I think about Colin and his work are that he is, first of all, a technically brilliant painter, and that he is himself in his painting, and as you will hear, in himself, a person of extraordinary thoughtfulness and integrity. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him. Colin, you're very welcome.
Colin, thank you very much.
Colin, we're two Colins, obviously. We're almost parallel in time, in age, and in background as well, as may become apparent as we discuss. He's the talented one of the set of twins. Colin, we had a phone conversation ahead of this event, and one of the things that was really interesting for me is that your pause around the conversation and the event was around the title, My Identity. And I think you had a certain reservation, in a way, at the beginning about what the event might be about, which was about saying what your identity is, being labelled in a way, and being asked to speak to a particular identity. So let's begin with that. Where does the hesitation come from, and how do you explain it?
I think for me, at the time, whenever we spoke, I realised I had to formalise and sort out what my identity actually was. If I'm coming to talk about what my identity is, I kind of need to know what it is. And there's so many facets to that, so many aspects to it that I'm just unsure about, and that float a bit and have blurred lines around them and are not built on any conviction, but they're built on just, I've happened to have been born in a certain part of the world. I happen to have been born into a Protestant home. So my reluctance was at not being able to speak with any sort of specificity about what my identity actually was and is. But as time has gone on and I've really started to formalise it in my own mind, I suppose, I have uncovered with myself a number of interesting aspects that I suppose were surprise to me, and also how, whenever I came to think about it, how formalised my sense of identity actually was.
And are you happy talking about your early years, your school years, childhood, and how that we talked a little bit about this in our conversation about how that forms you as a person. Obviously, in the North, growing up in a divided education system, that instills a certain way of thinking about yourself. And yet, when I look at your work, I see exactly the blurred lines that you have just mentioned. So, when you look back on your early years, maybe as a younger child or a teenager, is that something you're comfortable with? Do you think back with discomfort on the upbringing that you had, the kind of social upbringing, not your parental upbringing, but the social circumstances? Do you reflect critically on it, or do you think it shaped who you are?
Yeah, I mean, you can't grow up in the 70s and 80s in southwest Belfast without still feeling the remnants of something uncomfortable about what we term identity. I was born into a Protestant home, a moderate unionist home, and lived in a part of Belfast that would have been mainly Protestant, but actually quite mixed. And I suppose I was aware whenever I went to Finicky Primary School, which was quite a Protestant primary school, that I was being exposed to words, phrases, to demeaning words about Catholics that I hadn't been aware of before. And that, I suppose, made me slightly uncomfortable, but it has a weird sense of cementing in place what your identity is. In Belfast in those days, although bearing in mind I was a kid, you know, your identity could be in certain parts of the city the difference between being killed or not, walking up the wrong street, and I became very and acutely aware of that, and I suppose we all had to develop some sort of an instinctive, sophisticated sense of where we stood and as to what side of the divide we stood on. What's really interesting is that I was never really terribly comfortable in doing that. Whenever I was in my mid-teens, my family joined an interdenominational Christian community in Belfast where Protestants and Catholics met together. And that was quite groundbreaking at the time, quite risky at the time as well, whenever I look back on it. Corresponds, I suppose, with the time whenever I left grammar school and joined and went to Belfast School of Art, as it's known now, and, you know, exposed to so many different ways of thinking, exposed to the fact that the stereotypes weren't accurate at all, that the experiences of other people could, and hearing those and engaging with them, could enrich my sense of living as a human being in this part of the world rather than take away from it.
And to go in to study art, I mean, I suppose a lot of people have the experience that you're talking about, or a lot of people had the experience that you're talking about going through the education system in the North in the 80s and 90s, the grammar school system, for example, and then into university, and going to university might be the first time they spent a lot of time with people from the other side, in quotation marks. But was studying art something that enhanced that changed it in a very particular way? Because I'm, again, thinking about the art that you come to make, which very much has that sense of looking for, we'll see the landscapes in a minute, of looking at Belfast as a whole city, not a divided city, but a whole city. So did art play a role in it, and how did you come to decide you were going to do art at university, coming through school, and then where did that choice form itself?
I mean, I would say that studying art and making art definitely impacted that. When you go to art school, and even whenever you're making any work of art, there's no benchmark. There is an element that you're making it up as you're going along, and as an artist, I think that uncomfortable position is the moment, is the space that we need to inhabit to make anything of substance. You got to be out of your comfort zone. So being out of my comfort zone meant being out of what I conventionally saw as my identity. So yes, it was off to a good head start with doing that. The history behind me being an artist and wanting to go to art school to start off with was very much, I grew up in a very creative home. My father taught art and was a painter. And in the primary school that I went to, they employed a full-time art teacher. So I was exposed at an early age to the reality and the sense that following a career in art was something that was worthwhile. And whilst it's not an easy path, it has its peaks and troughs, many more troughs than peaks, but that it was something that was an option in the academic world. And so following through, I went to Methody in Belfast as well, very academic school. But I sort of carved out my own little route in art and realised at a reasonably early age that we talked about benchmarks there, and there were no benchmarks, that actually instead of using the work, I'm going to talk art here, but instead of using the work and the achievements of the heroes of mine, it was much more helpful and much more exciting to use myself as my benchmark, use the work that I did yesterday as my benchmark, and to attempt to build on that, improve, learn something from my own craft, rather than to only strive to be as good as somebody else.
So let's move on to think about the paintings you were probably known for at the beginning, which were the landscape paintings. And we might have maybe move on and show people some of the images. So we've landscapes of Belfast. Yeah. One of the things that strikes me about them is as I said, there's a whole city there, a kind of undivided city in the way that's seen, and the point of view tends to be quite high as well. And the other thing, I was looking at them again last night, the other thing that struck me was how the flesh tones that eventually appear in your portraits start to appear in the landscapes as well, the same kind of palette. So it's almost like the city is a person. It's a portrait, it's a landscape, but it's also a portrait as well. So when you were doing the landscape work, what were you thinking about the city as a place? They're very affectionate paintings, I think, but is that right? Is that how you look at it, in an affectionate kind of way? Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that you as the viewer, anybody as the viewer, me as a viewer of somebody else's art, poetry, film,
photography, anything in the broad arts. We, as people who engage with those works, are constantly filling gaps. Gaps left by the person who made that, unintentionally often and subconsciously. But that's where the power of art lies, that we can at times find ourselves translating something. And actually you have translated those Belfast paintings and you've said something which has been said to me for the first time. And that is the flesh tones starting to appear. I'd never thought of that. I've never heard anybody else saying that before. But that's what you've read. You filled in the gaps in your own way. So that's the first thing. The other aspect is to more talk about my hometown. And you mentioned affection there. I do love Belfast. I have had a love affair with Belfast throughout my life. Although I live in North Down now, I also call Belfast my home. I think we can often in our lives think that what is ordinary to us is ordinary to everybody else. But in actual fact, what is ordinary to somebody else, I can find extraordinary. I can find it fascinating. Belfast was ordinary to me. I knew it. When I say I knew it, I don't think you can ever get to know it. It's way more complex and multifaceted than anybody can ever get their teeth into. But no one had really painted landscapes of Belfast. People had made paintings through the troubles of Belfast and the conflict and the destruction, and made particularly really impactful photographic series of work. But I was interested in looking, actually going right back to the tradition of Irish landscape and looking at my hometown in a completely different way as an artist. Belfast affords you many treats. You can get high up on many high viewpoints. Black Mountain on one side, the Castlereagh, Craigantlet Hills on the other side. And you can get a panoramic view by standing on your feet. You don't need to be in a plane. You don't need to get a drone. You can just be standing there with a sketch pad. And so that series of paintings that you allude to, I'd painted Belfast since my teens. I remember one of the earliest paintings that I ever made was in school, and it was a Belfast scene. But I made an exhibition called No Continuing City in 2002 through to 2004, and it was big Belfast paintings, very similar to what we see here, looking at the city from these viewpoints, looking at the formal aspects of pattern, colour, light, space, but also the psychological aspects, where here was a being, here was an entity that was living and breathing, that was finding its feet, discovering itself after the decades of trauma that it went through. And I found myself exploring that aspect subliminally more and more. And that's maybe where you're filling those gaps yourself. And it's still endlessly fascinating to me. I just unveiled last year a new big Belfast painting in Waterman Restaurant in Hill Street in Belfast. and it's a multifaceted Belfast painting. And so I still try and make at least one of my Belfast paintings each year. It's a bit of a touchstone, personally.
So some of those, the kind of the brightness and the colours and the wholeness of the city in a way that we see in some of those, you're suggesting to some extent that that's changed a little bit post Good Friday Agreement, is that right? You were looking at a kind of hopefulness in a way in the landscape, and I was curious about how you would come on in a minute to the plight of victims and survivors, which you've been very vocal about and also painted and actually acted on post Good Friday Agreement. But if you cast your mind back to those years of maybe 98, 99, 2000, I was living in Belfast then. It was an odd time. It was a very hopeful time. It struck me as a kind of very quiet time as well. It was as if everyone was going around holding something very breakable, and no one wanted to shout in case someone got surprised and dropped it. Yeah. And how do you look back on those years? Because because we share a kind of generational span, they seem to me very pivotal years in my psychic life, if you like, because like you, I'd be very invested in the place. But how do you look back on it now and that initial post-Good Friday Agreement period?
I think that whole period, since the ceasefires actually in '94, although they were broken, I think there was a sense of hope that started to be seen in the cracks, that there was a little bit of light starting to appear and hope. I think for me, post '98, there were two things going on in my mind. Firstly, my family was young. I had two young kids, and I was aware of the future for them. But also I was aware very much about what the Good Friday Agreement didn't do. I was aware that things were still broken. Things still are broken now. Things will always be broken. I was very aware specifically about the fact that victims and survivors were not really mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement, save for a few lines which Monica McWilliams insisted were in it. And it alluded to the fact that we need to at some point do something about this. It acknowledged the pain, but didn't make any tangible efforts to show a direction and a way forward as to how we ultimately deal with what we did to each other, and of the fallout and of the trauma and of the hurt and of the grief still left. And that, so there was a duality there with me where I was incredibly hopeful. I was getting on with my life. I was seeing, and I think as well, and you'll probably find this as well, Colin, that there was a sense that it was normal life back in the 70s and 80s. But post 98, you realised, my goodness, that so was not. There was a tangible cloud of fear, which you sensed starting to be lifted. That's the psychic aspect that you're talking about. You're actually, you're aware of these things. And there were those two very clear senses that I had post 1998 and in the early days of the restoration of some sort of a political system.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in amongst all the hope, there's in the kind of post-98 years, 3 or 4 years after that, there was also, I've kind of felt this sense of, it could have been like this when I was 17. I would have enjoyed this when I was 17, more than what it was actually like when I was 17. But so let's take those two aspects. Well, after the Good Friday Agreement in particular, you've been doing portraits anyway, but the portraits that you did, there were a series of portraits that you did that became really well known because, in a sense, they were associated with the negotiations post factum.
Yeah.
You had George Mitchell and you did most of the protagonists: Ian Paisley, Mark McGuinness, John Hume.
A few of those, yeah.
So those became a kind of, in a way, a reflection on the process, and something that you became really well known for. So I think for all of us, when we look at those, one of the things I think of is you being in the room with the people that you paint, this experience. The paintings are so intense, and if anyone, most of you will know them, but they are quite big as well. So they're quite overwhelming when you see them, and they speak to something that seems actually like quite an overwhelming personal experience for both the sitter and you painting them. So could you take us through when you do a portrait of someone who has that kind of public presence? How do you go about it, and how do you choose the pose? How do you interact with the person to get them to relax, or to get what they want to be in the portrait, or what you think should be the portrait?
I'll go back to what I said at the start about needing to be out of your comfort zone. I think in any portrait sitting to start off with, I'm out of my comfort zone. I'm out of my depth, actually. I'm meeting this person for the first time. Sometimes it's a commission. The portrait of David Trimble, which you see, was a commission that Queen's asked me to do. The John Hume one was for Westminster. And some of the other ones, like the Paisley and McGuinness paintings, just happened because people introduced me to them. There was no commercial or any other agenda behind it. A sitting is often 2 to 3 hours. I sit and make 30 or 40 what I call shorthand drawings. They're automatic line drawings where it's as much about the act of recording as what is recorded. They're much more akin to the way that Jackson Pollock would have painted, rather than the way that somebody like Freud might record. They're about making myself comfortable in a very uncomfortable scenario where there are 2 people in a room. One of them is intently looking at the other. That's uncomfortable. There's a camera there as well, and I photograph, then bring everything back to the studio and make the painting, build the painting from that. But I was aware, as I was painting, particularly these political paintings, the George Mitchell painting, the Trimble, the Hume, Paisley, McGuinness. It wasn't deliberately built as a body of work. It was just these people were introduced to me, and it was suggested, would I like to paint them? And I went, well, actually, yes, I would. And it's not until you're in that situation that you realise, what was really interesting was having McGuinness sitting in my studio. Someone who had so clearly and evidently become a man of peace. In my eyes, talking to him about the past, talking to him about his experiences, and then attempting to, in some way, portray the honesty of who this human being is behind any facade, which is what my paintings are always about. There is, and Picasso said it, I think, there is self-portrait, or every painting is a self-portrait. That's what he used to say. And if that is true, or if there's any element of truth in that, then any portrait is bound to be a big element of self-portrait. So yes, I do. I see reflections of myself. I see elements of who I am in every person that I paint, I think. We're all human beings. That goes back to the identity question. We're all fundamentally human beings on this planet trying to figure out and muddle amongst everything else what we're doing here, why we're here, and how we're going to get through it. And that's common. We found many solutions and many answers to questions that are different. But essentially that's it. And I think that that's what I find endlessly fascinating about the human being as a source, human being as a subject to paint. It's endless. It's like starting again. Every time I meet someone new, it's like starting again to paint. Okay, I know how to mix colours. I know how to draw, but that human being is unique, and this is going to be like starting again.
It's a very intimate set.
It is. It's just the two of us. Most of the time, when I painted Ian Paisley, his wife was there as well. He hadn't been terribly well. What was fascinating about that encounter was how warm each of the sitting of McGuinness, the sitting of Paisley happened at different times. But I made each of them aware that I wanted this to be a duo of paintings. These paintings were never going to be seen apart. I'm always very conscious that I don't want to celebrate anything that a human being stands for. That's peripheral to me as an artist. You know, there's the other aspect of there's a job of work to be done. You know, I just have to flip and make a painting. You know, I better get the information that I require. I better study them well enough. But so there's that aspect of having a job to do. But no, it struck me whenever Paisley and McGuinness were separately in the studio how warm and affectionate each of them was towards the other. And how, you talk about whenever you were in your teens, thinking back, whenever you were, thinking back a few years after the Good Friday Agreement, going, why couldn't it have been like this in my teens? I did look at them both, and I remember tangibly thinking it and going, why couldn't you two guys have got together 20 years ago? I didn't say it, but I felt it.
And you're absolutely right. We all project things onto the art that we see and what we read, and we interpret each in our own way. I find the David Trimble portrait really extraordinary amongst men. They're all extraordinary, but I find that one particularly, he looks so haunted in some way. And obviously I project back to that, the kind of years after the Good Friday Agreement, when there was immense bravery in many ways in what he did. He took a real gamble, and I was at the premiere of Alan Gilson's new film the other day, and someone says in that film that Trimble knew that, in that sense, he was probably tearing apart the Ulster Unionist Party at the time. That's debatable, but certainly he took a gamble, and he had a very hard time from many sides. But I just see that as such a haunted kind of look, and I see the other looks that there are lots of different kinds of expressions, and there's warmth and there's anxiety in some of the people who are painted in the portraits, and his is just so gaunt and kind of not scared, but there's something. And then I think about you sitting across from. I think about this extraordinary kind of existential moment that passes between two people, where the intimacy of looking and being looked at and then recording that just seems incredibly strong. I don't know how you come out of that without a slight traumatization yourself, of looking so intensely at someone and seeing their life. Because a portrait is, there's a memorial side to it as well. There's an encapsulating someone, and we come on and talk about the silent testimony work, which does that too. So, do you ever get a bit overwhelmed by the person in front of you?
I always do. And, you hit on something there as well, which is so right. You come out of every encounter slightly changed. Sometimes you don't know how you're slightly changed, but you're aware that you are. And that's the immense privilege and byproduct of what I do, that actually I'm afforded a few hours in the company of people who have achieved so much, who have given so much, risked so much, are so much part of our collective history. I don't take that for granted at all. But it's, in some ways, Colin, I paint what I see. Whenever you're in the moment with someone, as I've said, there's nothing, I'm totally aware that I'm an artist with a job of work to do. I need to make sure I get the moment that I'm looking for, which is often the moment where the sitter is unaware of me being in the room. That's what I sort of look for. Almost we're intruding. We're seeing this person as they are on their own. That's why a lot of the sitters aren't looking at me. In fact, when I painted the great Paul Muldoon, we were talking about music the whole time, and we didn't disengage at all. We were engaged the whole time, and I wasn't getting the moment that I was looking for at all. And until after about 2.5 hours, he put his head back and let out a sigh, and he closed his eyes. I think he was losing the will to live. And that was the moment for him where he thought I was least interested. He thought, right, well, just take a wee break here while I sigh. But actually, that was the moment that I was most interested in. And it's the only portrait painting that I've made of somebody with their eyes closed. So that's a little aside. You're reading into the portrait. You're filling the gaps in the Trimble painting. You're reading the haunted look. Now, I understand how you are, because I look at that painting and I read that as well. There's nothing mystical about that particularly. But in some ways it's paint on a bit of cloth that you're reading. In its purest sense. Obviously, he was ill at that time. He hadn't been well. He had been undergoing treatment, and he was in remission at that stage. But he had lost a huge amount of weight. He wasn't, from an aesthetic point of view, he didn't look like the David Trimble that I was aware of looking at on our screens, 15, 20 years before. But it has to be an honesty is the key to it. Sometimes I end up making a painting of someone where there is a risk that they will hate the painting. In fact, most of my paintings have that. A lot of the sitters don't end up liking the paintings as well. Because I'm thinking about it myself, and I've painted myself a few times, if you're attempting to glimpse behind the facade, and I believe we all have a facade, it's self-imposed. I have a facade that is self-imposed where I try and hide the bits about me that I don't like from you. And I think we possibly all do that. If I'm trying to glimpse behind that, and I'm in any way successful and make a painting 4 foot square, there's going to be something that the sitter will find uncomfortable.
So let's move on to that other aspect of the fallout of the Good Friday Agreement that you talked about earlier on, which is about the silence around the role of victims and survivors of the Troubles in the original Good Friday Agreement, and in a sense the unresolved nature of that since. And obviously we know that very recently that's not just unresolved, it's actually badly resolved and in some ways unethically resolved. Could you talk a little bit about how some people will know these paintings and how they came about, some people won't? Could you give people a sense of what the series is called Silent Testimony, how it came about, what it represents, and then whatever you're able to say maybe about some of the, or maybe one of the individual experiences that you had of going and painting these survivors and victims and relatives?
It goes back to that period that we talked about in a bit of depth, just the few years after the Good Friday Agreement. So I'll not repeat myself in what I said there about what the Good Friday Agreement didn't hold, the promises it didn't make. But as time went on, I realised that the victims and survivors from my part of the world were paying the price for our peace. What I mean by that is where the Good Friday Agreement offered us as a society hope for the future, a beginning of hope for many of the victims and survivors who I have got to know. And indeed, it was a sense that I had back then. This is bound to be an end of hope for them. Hope for answers. Hope for justice. The perpetrators were free. I had that naive view. Many of the perpetrators, of course, aren't free. There's trauma in every part of that period of time. But my heart went out to those people who'd lost loved ones. And we were, as a society, talking about moving on. And I just went to myself, how can we as a society move on when we haven't even acknowledged that this massive section of our community exists? And they're expected to pick up the pieces on their own with the assistance of incredible organisations like We Have Trauma, and to to be seen as being too difficult a problem to address. As time went on, I then realised that actually what was being swept under the carpet, i.e. how to deal with our past, was incredibly hard. But I'll tell you this, it's not as hard as having to pick up the pieces of your loved one from the street after they've been blown up in a bomb. That's the hardest of all. And what we did was, and what we are continuing to do, I believe, is to continue to sweep this problem under the carpet and to let these people get on with their grief. Ongoing grief, by the way. I know this firsthand. Not that I've experienced, but the people who I've spoken to. Trauma. Unhealed wounds. And my sense was very clearly before I made silent testimony that if we were to have a future in our society, it needed to be built on us at least being willing to acknowledge what we did to each other, but also to acknowledge what is left behind. And that this gaping wound, which is still there, won't just go away. The best we can hope for in any wound is that there's a scar. A wound never goes away. And so silent testimony was, whenever I started making my large-scale portrait paintings in 2010, I realized I might have found the vehicle through which to explore and express those very, very passionate feelings and senses and views in my art. And it was a simple idea that instead of painting great and good, people who'd achieved much, I was going to paint people who weren't known outside their family and friends, afford them the gravitas that the Queen, Heaney, Clinton would be given with a portrait, and paint them purely because they had suffered loss through the Troubles. What was critically important is that I didn't want it to be a looking back exercise. This wasn't about dragging anybody back in time or dragging the past into the now. This is looking at right now, back in 2015. But it still is about right now. This is what is left behind. These people we are passing on the street every day. Whilst there are 18, and there ended up being a body of 18 paintings, which I made through the assistance of Wave Trauma, and the Ulster Museum partnered me on it as well. We first showed the exhibition there in 2015. This was looking at raw human loss. It was not looking at Protestant loss or Catholic loss. You've got to remember, we tragically and horribly and unforgivably did see a difference between Protestant loss and Catholic loss and Protestant loss. And what I was attempting to do was to strip all those identities away. Even the identity of IRA, SAS, UVF, whenever I told the little stories beside. Maybe there's one of the stories I wrote beside. And stripping away, so you're looking at raw human loss, and one of the byproducts, Colin, was that people, whenever they saw the exhibition and came out, questioned why they needed to know who the Protestants and Catholics were. It goes back to identity being so ingrained in us that we're willing to kill for it. We're willing to die for it because of a label or a badge that is given to us at birth, over which we have no control. And all of those things were explored in silent testimony. But essentially, it was an acknowledgement that tens of thousands of people like these 18 live amongst us and still live amongst us.
And I suppose one of the things that we're willing to do because of our identities or through our identities is fail to acknowledge the trauma of others to the same extent we acknowledge our own. And I think that's what's so powerful about this kind of work. Is it possible, we've a couple more things to cover, but is it possible to talk about an individual experience that you had in making the silent testimony work? I know that I've read and heard you talk about some of those before, and I know it's really difficult and it tends to personalise where you want to see a group of people, but it's a powerful testimony in and of itself. The fact of you sitting with someone, you both know why you're there. You're there because of something that they have suffered, some event that has made them suffer, and that's there in the room. So, is there a particular one that you think of when you look back on it that kind of that distills that experience that you try to capture in silent testimony?
I could pick any one of them. I really could. Each was a slightly life-altering, life-changing encounter. Traumatic encounter. But I'm going to choose Paul Riley. This is an image of the painting that I made of Paul. I went down to see Paul and his wife Anne in 2014. Wave had introduced us, and Paul was when I went and saw Paul, I met him first in their home in Warren Point. I was there because of the loss that Paul had suffered. I was aware that Paul had lost his daughter Joanne in a no-warning bomb attack in the 80s. And his daughter Joanne would have been exactly the same age as me. I knew the story, and I tend not in any of the portrait sittings to have any agenda as to what we talk about. And the portraits of silent testimony were no different. But because of why I was there, you're absolutely right. We each knew why I was there. And the stories inevitably just pour out. Paul is one of everybody was tangibly broken. Everybody who I painted was tangibly broken. But Paul in particular was an example of somebody's life which had just frozen. He could hardly talk about it still. I've talked about the fact that the painting needs to be right, and we often work our way around the house or the room, checking the light and trying different rooms to see where the light is best for the painting. And he brought me upstairs to Joanne's bedroom, and it was kept exactly as it was when she left that room for the last time. There was although she was in her early 20s, there was a teenage bedspread, girl's bedspread, matching curtains. There was a bookcase with cassette tapes, a little cassette player, her music, the cassette's still in the cassette player. There was a clock on the wall, a little pink girl's wall clock, which Anne and Paul had decided to stop and freeze at 10:01 because that was when the bomb went off. And Paul sat on her bed, and that's where the sitting for this portrait took place. The light streaming through the window was beautiful. But the most beautiful room in the house was Joanne's bedroom. And that cannot, you know, that's a life-altering experience. It's a humbling experience. It is, if anything is going to give you perspective on life and identity, it's that. Paul was he told me an anecdote which I put in the little bit of text. And he was a caretaker in Warrenpoint High School, or in one of the schools there. And he said he was doing his work on the morning that the bomb went off. And he said he heard the bomb going off, but it sounded like a door closing. And I just thought to myself, you're unaware of how profound that statement is. Because in so many ways, you did hear a door closing. It was a door closing on the rest of your life. So, it was encounters like that that made me realize that what I was doing could have some worth. Of course, an artist's work is solitary work. I'm in my studio on my own. I have no idea when I'm spending the year making these 18 paintings what the response is going to be. I'm doing it for me, doing it for myself. I'm exercising something in myself and doing it. That's a lot of what art's about. It's about getting something out, expressing it to myself, cathartic. But the exhibition has been received in the way that I suppose I would have hoped, where people are rethinking where we are now as a result of the past, and causing people to rethink and to think about intransigence, think about all of our parts in what went on. You know, what even in ourselves, what I talked about before, that whole idea of sitting and looking at a television news report at night and seeing the difference between a Catholic being killed and a Protestant being killed. How inexcusable is that? And yeah, so, but that's the power of art. That's not necessarily the power of my art. That's the power of art.
I think you're underestimating yourself a little bit. To build up to that moment, I think the discussion that we've had has shown how what you've done in your work leads up to the point where you can undertake that task of painting people who have a traumatic history and who are able to share it with you. And I think that's not just a skill, but I actually think it's a kind of ethical act in and of itself. We're going to finish up now. I just wanted people to see the most recent work that you've done, because I love it. These are self-portraits in windows. Yep. And partly just because they're so technically extraordinary, but they also, and you know my background is literary criticism and art criticism, so I see these and I want to write thousands of words about the complexity of what you've done here, the way that you've made a flat surface have depth, the way that you're thinking about looking at yourself and looking at yourself in all kinds of contexts. I'm fascinated that I think they're nearly all in capital cities. They all have an aspect of consumerism about them, and a sense of the facade that you mentioned earlier on. So I don't have anything profound to say about them, just that they are so extraordinary. And I'm kind of curious and this is where we'll finish up, but how did you come to this then? You're someone who's very consistent in what you do, and progressive, and there's a progression in your work. Where did this come from, the sudden looking at yourself? I know it's this, in a way, it's the same thing you've been doing the whole time, is looking at cities, looking at people. Now you're looking at yourself in cities. But how do you feel about them, and why did you make them?
I think that reality is extraordinary. I think that we can sometimes, it goes right back to what I said about the things that are most ordinary to us are often extraordinary. It's absolutely incredible that we are living, breathing beings on this planet at this time, in this room. It is utterly mind-blowingly extraordinary. And I find reality actually, I see the extraordinary, the supernatural in that. I suppose the window paintings started pre the portraits, actually, where I was looking at the city and attempting to look at the city in a different way. And I looked at it as it appeared in the window reflections of shops. Well, what is real? What is not real? In actual fact, I realized that I was making these window paintings, that I wasn't painting the mannequins in the window or the bus or the street reflected. My subject was a sheet of glass. And in some ways it could actually be that the same sheet of glass that I was bringing around the world. It's just a sheet of glass, but it's extraordinary. The effect of light on that, because that's all it is. I suppose I started to be commissioned. I was commissioned to make a few self-portraits. The National Gallery of Ireland have a self-portrait of mine, and the Ruth Borchardt self-portrait collection in England have a big three-dimensional selfie of mine. See how we've shortened it to that within the smartphone generation. They're selfies. And I suppose what I wanted to do was what I was commenting on here with these window self-portraits where I appear in all of these reflections. It's an extension of the portraiture, yes, but it's also a comment on the throwaway nature of the image on the smartphone, the selfie, because these are actually the antithesis, the polar opposite of spending time in someone's company, getting to see behind the facade. These paintings are all facade. These paintings are not built up over to making drawing upon drawing upon drawing, preparation work. The subject matter for each of these paintings is a single image from a smartphone. And I wanted there to be a very clear distinction between the large-scale head portraits, the other self-portraits that I'd done. And so, yeah, I mean, look, we possibly could talk a lot more about these, and I have spoken in more depth about them whenever the Sotheby's exhibition was on with them. But yeah, they're certainly something that I'm continuing to explore now. There are so many levels and dimensions to them from a making point of view that I think is still getting me into the studio and making me want to still continue to explore it.
Well, for me, they show you as someone who thinks very deeply about what it means to be in the world and what kind of identities we accumulate and how we look at ourselves and how we understand ourselves. That brings us to the end of this part of the event. Do we have time for a few questions, Pádraig? Yeah. So I think there's a microphone. If anybody would like to ask Colin a question.
I think a lot of us hold back, not just in the field of art, but hold back on what could be our true potential through fear. And it can be a fear of many things. It can be a fear of what is my audience going to think of this. It can be a fear of, and I still have all these fears to a greater or lesser extent. Well, to a lesser extent now, but I mean, I'll say that you know, there are questions I've got all the time about showing work and putting work out because it doesn't fit in with what I've done before. It doesn't necessarily have a clear path or a clear route. Stylistically, awful word, but stylistically, these window paintings are totally different. I'm using a completely different method of painting. But I'm doing that because that is what is required from the vision that I've got with what I'm trying to express. I couldn't paint these in big, thick slabs and blocks. It has to be intricate and it has to be slavish to an extent. So I identify with everything that you're saying there. I have not in any way come up with any antidote to feeling that sense of doubt, that sense of fear, I suppose, in expressing myself, putting myself up on the walls for people to judge. It's terrifying. And that won't really ever go away. I would hope that it would, but that's part of the tension in an artist's life that yields moments of revelation, I suppose, and I don't want to overblow it, but that's kind of what you're getting at. It's I'm also very aware that, and I being a Chancellor of Ulster University, I'm being very aware of the amazing work, research work and teaching work that is done in the art schools and art institutions on the island. We all have a story to tell. We all do. We all have ideas and concepts, but I think sometimes the risk at an early stage in an artist's career is for them to feel that they're not saying anything of value, and therefore it's best not saying it at all and being safe. It goes back to what I was saying about you could have something extraordinary to say that's ordinary to you. And I think sometimes we bypass that and miss that in sometimes, not all the time, in the way that art is taught, in the way that painting is taught. What gets me into the studio every day and gets me excited about getting into the studio every day is that I've something new to learn. And if I've something new to learn, I'm not going to be making the same painting every day. In fact, I'm going to be making something quite different each day. And it's about wringing out, as you would a cloth. It's about wringing out every last bit of potential from life I, in a very non-religious way, view my life as a gift, and that I am enormously privileged to be here, and that I owe my life, that I get every bit of potential from that. So I give myself a hard time in that respect. And I'm also very aware that not everybody is afforded that privilege. For many people, and I've got to be aware of it, life does not seem like a gift. Okay? And I've got to be very conscious of that as I say that, you know. But thank you for your question. I imagine, David, and thank you for your question. If I'd have met with John Hume the day after, it would have led to a different painting. I saw John Hume on that day. I saw him as he was in his home in Green Castle, with Loch Foyle behind him, really quite advanced in his dementia. It's like, if I'm going to give this talk tomorrow, it'd be completely different. Or if we're going to have a chat, it'd be a completely different chat. What is wonderful from a human point of view, and then I'll get to talk about more the political. From a human point of view, you know, you could paint the same person again and again, and you would get a completely different painting. There is no right and wrong way to make a portrait painting, to make any painting. So, you'll know what I'm coming on to here. Yes, they would have been totally different paintings. It would have been fascinating to paint McGuinness in the 80s. It would have been, equally fascinating to paint Trimble or any of those protagonists in those days. But would Colin have read a haunting in David Trimble's eyes in those days? Probably not. There may have been, he may have read a defiance. He may have read something else that any of us can come up with. The McGuinness portrait, I probably wouldn't have been encountering somebody who I viewed as a man of peace. And that would have led to a very different painting as well. These are the things that we don't know. And what I would have hoped, though, is that I would have in the same ways got glimpses behind the facade, and at least there would be something of the spirit of that human being which would be consistent between the paintings. But that's the unknown, isn't that right? Thank you for your question. Let me just very briefly touch on the comments that you made there. All of the portraits are... People ask me why I sort of have this tendency to paint them where there's a really rough-hewn landscape feel to the flesh, and yet I paint the eyes in a different way. And I'm actually not terribly aware of painting anything in a different way. It kind of feels right every time to make the paintings like that. The reason being, and it's why I don't tend to relate to photoreal painting, or find it hard to relate to it, where everything's treated in exactly the same way. Whenever I see you again, or you see me again, I'm not going to recognize you by the tip of your ear or by the exact nuance of the way that hair is sticking out from your chin. And likewise, I'll recognise you by engaging with your eyes. That's how I will get to know you. And what I think I'm instinctively doing with those paintings is attempting to give people a head start in reading the paint on the canvas as a human being. So I'm not saying, so what I am saying is, this is the most important bit. Engage. I'm not aware of doing it, but I think reading enough into my own work, I'm aware that that's what I'm getting at. Silent Testimony, Dirk still continues to tour. We showed it at the Irish Arts Centre in New York last year. And this year, from April 24 through to February 25, the National Portrait Gallery in London have invited us to show it for nearly a year, which is utterly incredible. That's, to me, the world centre of portraiture. And it's incredible as an artist. But more important to me is the fact that those 18 stories, I look at Paul, Margaret, who you talked about, and I think, there is Paul sitting in Joanne's bedroom. Nobody was interested and had been interested to hear his personal story. And he was quietly living out his life in grief. And now potentially millions of people will be able to hear his story. And that's what that's about. And that's what the story of Silent Testimony is. So, thank you again for your question, Dirk.
And I think that perfectly embodies the power of Colin's work, why we wanted him to be one of our interviewees for this series. And I think now we've come to the end of our time. I just want to thank a few people first. Thanks to the Royal Irish Academy for hosting us. Thanks to Pádraig and this team from ARINS for sponsoring the series of interviews. I'd encourage you to look out for more. There'll be more coming in the next few months. And thanks to all of you for coming, braving the weather and getting out here. I hope you've enjoyed it. For me, Colin is a really extraordinary person, an extraordinary artist, an extraordinary man, someone who we can all look up to, who we can think about, who sends us away with a sense of the world as a rich place that we all have a place in. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to him today. Colin, thank you so much. And join me in thanking...
Thank you.